Sherwin Nuland. Thank you. I already gave you a sort of pre-introduction a little bit.
Nothing further is necessary. This is about the third or fourth or perhaps fifth time that I've heard Marvin Minsky speak. This is the first time that I've had the intimidating responsibility of following after him. The only way I can handle it is to make believe that he was a warm-up for my act. Actually, every time I hear him speak, I think of that famous old New Yorker cartoon. Two men are sitting at a bar. One is a younger man and one is an older man, perhaps in his 70s. And the older man is looking at the younger fellow and he's saying, "I am not a curmudgeon. I'm an ornery old bastard is what I am." Well, this is a very fast audience, isn't it? This is an anniversary of sorts for me. It's the first time that I've seen Richard in 2 years since I was on a stage at the TED conference in Monterey, your penultimate TED conference, I believe. And you know, Richard sends out these circulars in which he tells his speakers essentially what he'd like them to do, and he says, "I want you to be spontaneous. I want you to tell a story. I want you to talk about something that perhaps you've never talked about." Well, I had been to 2 previous TEDs, and I had decided what to speak about as I sat in the audience. On one occasion, actually, as I was coming up to the stage, speaking right after Hamilton Jordan at a TED Med, as a matter of fact. But there was something that was itching within me to talk about, and I had never spoken about it to anybody except people who knew me well. And I cleared it for a moment with Richard before we started, and I got up. I was standing, actually. And I began telling the story of the development and discovery of electroshock therapy. I talked about the fact that in the Middle Ages, it was thought that when someone was depressed or severely mentally ill, there were spirits within him, and the only way to get them out was to shake them out. So they would give people convulsive agents. Camphor was the major convulsive agent, and that seemed to work pretty well for some people. But it didn't get modern until the 1930s, when a group of Italian neurologists realized that their depressed patients who were also epileptic broke their cycle of depression every time they would have a convulsive seizure for a period of a couple of days, and then the depression would come back. So they reasoned that maybe if we convulse people with electricity, if they're severely depressed or have really bad mental illness like schizophrenia, we can cure it. So they got the police to find someone who'd been hanging around the Rome railroad station for months, gibbering, making no sense, clearly overtly schizophrenic, and they brought him into the laboratory. And they put some wires onto him, and they shot him with a very minimal jolt of electricity, but it was enough to make him sit right up and stare at them and to shout out the first rational thing he had said in years, and you can guess what it was. Translated literally from the Italian, it was, "What the fuck do you guys think you're doing?" Well, I stopped at that point, and I said to the audience, "I don't want you to think that I'm here to give you a history of electroshock therapy or the treatment of depression." I did something at that moment that, being at this particular conference, the TED conference, now the TED Med conference, gave me the courage to do, and Richard's presence 15 feet away from me particularly gave me the courage to do. I said, "I'm telling you this story because I'm leading up to the fact that in 1971, when I was in my early 40s, late 30s, I had 20 electroshock treatments because I was so severely depressed, and at that time, lobotomies were the rage. I barely escaped having a lobotomy, and I told the story of my illness. I'd never told that, as I say, publicly before. The response from that TED audience was extraordinary. And the response continued, because I was speaking on the first day, the response continued for the next 2 days. And having that courage gave me the courage then to write a book about it, which was published this January. Just to show that I'm not plugging the book, I won't even tell you the name of it. But I think it's for sale out there somewhere. And what it was the story of my life growing up in the Bronx in New York City to an immigrant family where no one could read and write English, and all the events that led up to the Depression. So when Richard called me, and I said I couldn't be here because my son was getting married in China the following week, he sent me back this email saying, "I'm devastated." Well, if that didn't tug at me, the next news did tug at me because it was the beginning of the SARS epidemic. So everything was postponed, and here we are together again. And what I've been thinking about a great deal in the last few years, certainly the last 2 years since I was here before, is, and you won't be surprised at this just looking at me, is aging, just getting older. And what is aging like, and what is the end of life going to be like for those of us who are septuagenarians? And I've been particularly thinking about two people. One quite young, one quite old, one a mythological person, and one a person all too real. The mythological one is known to everyone here. He's Narcissus. You remember the myth of Narcissus. He was this beautiful youth wandering through the forest one day, and he came on a large pool of water, and he looked into the water, and he saw this magnificent-looking person staring up at him. And he was intrigued by this person and fell in love with this person immediately and tried to speak to him. And he realized that this person was speaking back to him because his lips were moving. And he waved his arms in tokens of attempted embrace or symbolic embrace, and lo and behold, the person in the pond did the same thing. Well, he was so deeply in love and realized each time he tried to reach down to hold this beautiful young man that he couldn't. The young man would disappear. And he began finally to get to the understanding that he was never going to embrace this young man in real life. And he began pining away. And you know the rest of the story. He died, and the gods, feeling sorry for him, created this flower, the narcissus, and this is where the word comes from. I think if Narcissus were alive today, he wouldn't look into a pool. He'd look into the laboratory. He'd look into the laboratory or a group of laboratories of the brilliant molecular biologists who are telling us they are going to transform our bodies, who are telling us, as you heard a moment ago, that we might live 200 years, 250 years. And he would speak to them in terms of love because clearly he would adore what he heard. He would try to embrace them, and I suspect that wouldn't work very well either. And eventually he would pine away and die prematurely. The other person I find myself thinking about at the very other end of the spectrum is a 19th century French physiologist, one of the first physiologists. His name was Charles-Edward Sequard, actually Brown Sequard, because his father was an American and his mother was French, and he was usually called Sequard, but his real name was Brown Sequard. He was a brilliant researcher. His interests were in the nervous system, and he did a number of important studies, landmark studies. But he and his predecessor, because he was a professor at the Collège de France, his predecessor as the professor, as the chairman, a fellow named Claude Bernard, were the people who introduced the notion of so-called ductless glands that secrete these things called hormones into the circulation that control so many things, control our bodies, control the speed with which we function, maintain our stability in general. And it seemed to him as he got older and older that hormones had to be the key to youth, to rejuvenation. And in the year 1889, when he was 72 years old, which is precisely the age that I am right now, He appeared before the French Academy, and he told them that he had been crushing the testicles of dogs and guinea pigs and monkeys. I assume he took the testicles out first. He had been crushing these testicles and getting an extract, a liquid extract, and he had been injecting this into himself. And as he reported, I have indeed been rejuvenated. I can work better. There's a spring in my step, and my sexual prowess has come back. Well, of course, his mistress later told him that his sexual prowess hadn't come back. And as people watched him, they realized that he was continuing to age just like every person in his 70s, and indeed, 5 years later, he died a very old man. Well, many are the ways in which humankind has tried so hard over the generations, over the millennia, to figure out some way to keep our small time on Earth a little bit longer. Clearly, aging brings up fears of death. Clearly, aging by itself, with the decrepitude that comes with it, is threatening. Brown-Séquard was not obviously the last person to attempt rejuvenation these ways. There was a huckster in Kansas whose name was Charles Brinkley in the 1920s and 30s who actually implanted ovaries, testicles into thousands of people who came to him. He came to be so rich that he owned his own radio station. He ran for the governorship of Kansas. Since it wasn't Texas or Florida, he didn't win. But at least he ran. And even to this day, there are rejuvenation clinics in various parts of this country, usually in the Southwest. As a matter of fact, there's a heavy concentration of them in Southern California, where you can go and have fistfuls of antioxidants swallowed. They inject you with fetal cells, all kinds of stuff like this. Well, remember all of the excitement about 15 years ago when some of our molecular biologist colleagues began telling us that with genetic engineering, it looked like it was going to be possible to increase that lifespan. At first, to 150 years, and then to 200 and maybe more. But that was nothing compared to the excitement about, 5 or 6 years ago, when they began talking about telomeres. Most people here probably know what telomeres are, but for those who don't, let me talk about it just for a minute. A telomere is a little cap-like structure, looks like a dunce cap at the very end of a chromosome. And it's been observed for a long time that as a cell divides, the telomere gets smaller. And finally, when the cell has reached the maximum number of divisions, something between 25 and 50 with the cells that most researchers have been working with, the telomere disappears. So it was reasoned that if some way could be found, since the telomere reflects aging, could be found to keep the telomere from getting smaller, or maybe even enlarge it, aging might stop. And lo and behold, it was discovered that there was a gene that codes for an enzyme called telomerase that stops the telomere from getting smaller, sometimes makes it larger. And when they used telomerase in some of their research cellular lines, they discovered, yes, that these cellular lines kept dividing beyond, let's say, 50. And so it seemed that not only could cells be made to live longer, but maybe the whole organism could be made to live longer, the organism that is you and me. There's a vanity in this. There's a vainglory in this. The fact is, the biological fact is that our function, our sole function as animals on this planet, by the laws of nature, is simply to pass on our DNA to the next generation, and perhaps to live a little bit beyond that so that we can nurture our young. Some of the mammals do this, but in the wild and even in domesticated animals, it's unusual for any of these creatures to live much beyond that point. We are the only animal that does this, and we live into our 70s and our 80s. Average life expectancy now is 77 years. We like to think that much of that is because of the great medical wonders that have occurred. Turns out that very little of it is because of the great medical wonders that have occurred. Laurie Garrett, I'm sure, will confirm to you that the reason that we were at a 45-year life expectancy in 1900 and a 77, 78-year life expectancy now has largely to do with public health measures like immunization, improvement of the water supply, better housing, better clothing, things of this nature. That the surgical tinkerings and the biochemical oral manipulations and injectable manipulations don't save enough people in the entire world population to really make any significant difference. So here we are living this very long time, and it doesn't seem to be enough for us. We are looking for the key to live longer. Bill Hazeltine is somewhere out over the Atlantic right now, and he's not here to defend himself. But about 2 years ago, he told Nicholas Wade, who writes for the Science Times on Tuesday, that he felt reasonably certain, and it was echoed a moment ago in Marvin Minsky's talk, that we would be living a lot longer beyond our normal lifespan, sometime within the next 20 or 25 years. And here's the quote. This is what he told Wade. Our generation is the first to be able to map out a possible route to immortality. Immortality, not 200 or beyond, as if our individual mortality is of some benefit to the planet, is of some benefit to anybody but ourselves. It gets even worse. There's a futurist whose name is Gregory Stock that many here in the audience know. He was at the last TED a few months ago out in Monterey. And Greg has written a book called Redesigning Humans. And by this he means, of course, the phenomenon that we've all read about, which is reaching the point with genetic manipulation where two parents can come to the appropriate place and choose what hair color they want for their kids, whether he'll be a good basketball player, well, whether she'll be brilliant in biology, things of this nature. And the book, bad enough that he calls the book Redesigning Humans, but the subtitle is The Inevitable Future. Not, we'll be able to do this, but we inevitably will do this. It's the title of the first chapter of that book that really gets me. The title of the first chapter is The Last Human. In The Last Human, he's talking about people like us, people who are what we are because of the DNA that we've inherited from two parents and because of the nurture that we've experienced throughout our lifetimes. That will be passé, says Greg Stock, in 50 years. And we will all be redesigned. And interestingly, the last humans, and the implication is clear, they will not be humans, these generations that succeed us. And it's all very scary. It's scary for a lot of reasons, ecological reasons and other reasons, economic reasons that I don't need to go into. You can imagine and guess what they are. But it's scary for me personally as a physician who spent 30 years at the bedside of sick people. These are not problems with which American medicine, in my view, should be struggling. Betterment, enhancing the life that we have, are the kinds of problems that we should be struggling with. This is really the first generation in which the aim of medicine has not been just to cure disease and relieve suffering, but to so change the kinds of lives that we live that we will be existing in a future that's unimaginable to us now. And to me, that's not the role of medicine. Well, when we talk about aging and we talk about the possibility of living longer, we all recognize, of course, that we've already experienced a great increase in the aging part of our population. Just look around you when you go out on the street, when you go home, there are a lot more old people than there were before. Here are a few interesting statistics that illustrate it. Queen Victoria, Elizabeth, I am old. Queen Elizabeth customarily sends a birthday card to every one of her subjects who's turned 100. In her first year, 52 to 53, she sent 255 birthday cards. In the year 2001, she sent 20,000 birthday cards. That's a big change. We're seeing, and you saw Laurie's slide, that a pyramid, a graph of our population, is no longer the pyramid it used to be, with lots of children at the bottom and gradually tapering off oldsters. It's increasingly resembling a chimney. Some people are saying that it's resembling almost a rectangle. Of course, there's a great price that we pay for that. The price is to be found in nursing homes where people sit requiring help with the simplest daily living activities, even toileting and dressing. We're seeing it among our homebound elderly who need a great deal of help, need a great deal of financial help. A great deal of our nation's budget goes into that period. And you've heard the statistic, which I do think is somewhat exaggerated, that 90% of our medical bill is spent in the last 6 months of life. If we stretch that out for about 2 years, it's probably 90% in the last couple of years of life, because we are constantly needing to treat older people whose decline is a gradual one like this. Now, what can be done about this? What can be done about this in a society so fascinated by the notion of living 200 years and less fascinated, it has seemed, with the other notion of making our declining years not declining years, but years that have value to us, value to society, and value to those we love? Well, the whole philosophical outlook for these kinds of things changed in 1980 when James Fries, who's a gerontologist, and gerontology as a research tool was a relatively new thing in 1980, gerontologist at Stanford University came up with a notion of what he called compressed morbidity. The idea that instead of people declining, as I say, in this very slow curve, wouldn't it be nice if debility could be postponed until very near the end of life? So there would be this very short period of perhaps months and then a rapid drop-off. It's reminiscent of Oliver Wendell Holmes, the father, who is a doctor, not the Supreme Court judge, who was a poet in addition to everything else and a wonderful writer, and wrote this very well-remembered poem in which he talks about the one-horse shay. And the one-horse shay will destruct, but it'll never slowly rust and break down. I'd like to read you the 4 lines in which he talks about this in metaphor, because he's really talking about the human body. Wouldn't it be nice if this could happen? You see, of course, you're not a dunce, how it went to pieces all at once. All at once, and nothing first, just as bubbles do when they burst. That has been what Fries's idea of compressed morbidity has aimed for, and that was caught on to by many gerontologists, and clearly they had been studying and began to study even more. What is it that makes people unable to care for themselves during those last years and months of life? And lo and behold, they discovered something that is now common knowledge, but when they first found it out in the mid-'80s was quite a surprise. It wasn't any named disease that took away people's independence, but simply physical frailty. When we get past the age of 30, we can no longer make protein in quite the same way we did before. It's more difficult to build muscle. It accelerates by about 40, but it really gets into high gear when we're 50. In the years between 50 and 70, we lose approximately a third of our muscle mass. And my neurologist friends tell me it isn't just the quantity of muscle, but the remaining fibers are weaker than those fibers were before. Well, if the real reason that people can't live independently is simply physical frailty, what can be done to improve that? It seems to be such a natural thing. We don't have much control over it. Young people go to the gym and they build up their muscles, but obviously old people don't do that. So they tried to bring old people to the gym. And they chose what we call the oldest old, people between 85 and yonder. And they discovered that if you use stress exercises with increasing weights, within 6 weeks, an 85-year-old person can double his or her strength. And it goes on like this. Well, of course, they did this with many people, and they did try to increase another kind of strength that they realized was particularly important to avoid debility and the kind of senescence that comes with old age, which is the mental part of it. We know very well now that the more you use your brain, the better it works, the better the neurotransmitters are secreted at those synapses. We know, for example, as a result of research of the last 10 years, that brain cells do indeed originate even in old brains. They continue to, but they need to have some stimulus. So the gerontologist's focus, unlike the molecular biologists in their laboratories, the gerontologist's focus became to increase the strength of people's minds and increase the strength of their muscles, because if you increase muscular strength, not only are you able to care for yourself better, but it increases stress on bones, which means the bones continue to build up and there's much less osteoporosis. Well, since we've known about smoking for a long time, we've known about diet for a long time, and since in the early 80s the gerontologists began to push people to do more exercise, 20 years go by, is there any evidence that any of this has had any effect? Well, lo and behold, there is. Nationally, in 1982, when a particular 17-year study began, since then followed by a number of other long studies that confirmed it, nationally 6.4% of our population was in nursing homes, unable to care for itself. In the year 1999, 17 years after the beginning of the study, that figure was down to 4.2%, approximately two-thirds of what it had been before. There's another famous, often talked of study that was repeated, several times, but it started at the University of Pennsylvania. And what happened in that study was that they followed a large group of alumni, and they found out that by using the stratagems of exercise, not smoking, good diet, doing a lot of reading, which supposedly Penn graduates do anyway, they could postpone their debility by an average of 7.75 years. Well, this is sort of interesting to me, and it's particularly interesting to me because 2 weeks ago I went to a meeting, actually an alumni reunion of my old college class. We've been out for 50 years. And I got to talking with one of my old chums who I hadn't seen in a few decades. And he said to me, in the midst of talking, that his wife had died a couple of years ago. And he had rediscovered the attractions of very young women. And his performance, he said, was inconsistent and therefore embarrassing. And the way he was going to solve it was that 2 weeks hence, actually it would be today, tomorrow, he was going to have a penile prosthesis put in. And I looked at him in horror, in shock. And as I looked at him, I realized he was also wearing a toque. Well, the whole thing seemed very, very peculiar to me. Vanity of vanities, said the preacher. All is vanity. But it's been 2 weeks now. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that if an older person is wearing a toque or a wig, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's the first step in buying a gym membership or a bunch of books. And as for that penile transplant, it's hard for me to believe that I'm the only old codger around here who's starting to think it might not be a bad idea. Thank you very much.
His last book, Lost in America, I've never seen any book get more universally stupendous reviews. No matter where you see a review of that book, it's over the top. Lost in America. It's really amazing.